Well, I don't know if you all know, but I actually ended up in the Mid-South area by being hired by the Memphis State or the University of Memphis in like 85 or 86. So I probably wouldn't be here or have had the fantastic career I've had at Arkansas State University if it hadn't been for that first one-year visiting artist position. At that time, they had a program where every year they would hire someone for a year in a different area. So it would be a kind of a fresh flow of ideas coming into the art department. One year would be printmaking, another year would be sculpture, painting. I don't think that
now it doesn't exist.
Program exists anymore. But anyway, that's how I ended up here. And when I came for my interview, I met with the dean, and I think this building was fairly new at the time.
It opened in 81.
Okay. So, and I remember walking with him through this corridor and thinking, man, that is an awesome space to do something. And it was always in the back of my mind over the years to, if the opportunity ever came up, to do a project that would take advantage of all this cubic feet. So I thought I'd start by talking a little bit about the evolution of disappearing ink, because it kind of really took a few curves from the very beginning. Over a year ago, Leslie contacted me and told me about this student activity fund project that they do every year that I think should involve student involvement. I think is part of the criteria of the kind of projects that can be done. And she had been reading the Museum of Innocence by Mr Pamuk, and was really interested in the way he treats ordinary objects and how ordinary objects have a certain magic. And so she thought, she was familiar with my work, as most of you guys are, and thought that, she wanted to do something that was kind of maybe somewhat inspired by his Museum of Innocence and do kind of a more localized version of that. So, she asked me to think about it and what might we come up with, what might we do. And the initial idea was to have people submit objects of importance and actually, to them, personal importance, and actually objects that, in order to kind of make the pool a little less scattered and all over the place, to have people, it would have to have a date on it. So it could be like a trophy, that you won for something, but it needed to have a month, a day, and a year. Could be a baby booty, could be a newspaper with that was important that had a date on it. So that was we were kind of going with that for a while, and thinking that that's what we were going to do. And actually, I was awarded a grant to go to Istanbul to see the museum, to see Pamuk's Museum of Innocence. And my hope was to kind of, soak it all in and to hopefully meet Mr. Pamuk and maybe even convince him to travel to the U.S., to our region, and maybe participate in some kind of seminar or something like that. Well, we got to Istanbul. One of the first things we did, I think we were there a day or two, and we made it over to the Museum of Innocence, which is a wonderful place. It's kind of I don't know how familiar anybody is with it, but it's a weird museum that is kind of totally fictitious. there's a connection between, there's a book, a novel called Museum of Innocence, written by Pamuk, and this is a museum that contains artifacts related to the story. It's sort of a love story of the book. So it's kind of this weird hybrid thing. You don't know whether it's a written word project or whether it's art, which of course interested me because many of you know that I'm a fallen English major. So it was fun to see it, and I made many efforts to try to speak to Mr. Pamuk. And the closest I got was talking to the secretary of the director of the museum. And I wrote a long, very thoughtful, nice email to the director, because that's the only way you could get to Pamuk, allegedly. Never heard anything. Never heard anything. Went back and followed up on it a few times. It kind of ticked me off. And actually, I talked to him, and this is the summer of the uprising in Turkey. And Les and I happened to be there during the heat of the Taksim Square riots and stuff. So there was a lot of we were meeting a lot of people, asking them about the political situation, also asking about Pamuk, and we spent a lot of time in the neighborhood around the Museum of Innocence where Pamuk would go to secondhand stores and accumulate the objects that would go into the museum. And we got some kind of mixed messages from the proprietors of these secondhand places about their feelings towards Mr. Pamuk. The general vibration was, he's kind of a phony. He lets off a certain, or he gives a certain air to he's very careful about his public image and what kind of interviews he will grant and the ones he won't, which I obviously got a taste of that. But a lot of them felt that he was kind of a bit of a manipulator, and that his alleged love for the common man was maybe not really followed through in some of his, I guess, dealings with ordinary people. So it kind of turned me off a little bit to the thing, you know, the fact that I didn't hear. So I started thinking, I don't know if, I don't know, I'm not feeling right about this. So I kind of went into a bit of a panic mode because I knew what Leslie was, where the starting point for this was. And I was a little nervous also about, as Lisa says, it's a kind of grassroots effort to accumulate things. I think has the possibility of going terribly wrong. In other words, nobody, participates. So that was always, and I'm kind of a control freak. And it made me nervous that I was just going to let that, que sera, sera, if it crashes and burns. I just could not, I couldn't handle it mentally, psychologically. So all this is going on in my head at the time in Istanbul, during the riots and all that stuff. And so I'm, oh man, what do I have that? So I'm one day I'm sitting there and I'm looking out on the, it's surrounded by water, and I'm looking out and I see all these seagulls, and it's just like, wait a minute, what about the space? You always wanted to do something with that space, and look at that. And you've got those damn newspapers that I had already thought about somewhere, someday, doing something like this. So it's just sort of like clicked. So it's sort of like a reaction to, I guess, things not going right, that maybe flipped it into the direction it really should go. So, you know, I thought about it, and then I think the first thing we did when we got back is I came back and met with maybe Jason or maybe a couple people, just to look at the space again and to say, am I remembering it correctly? Like this vantage point, you know, the other walkway, you know, and I'm there, yes, this will work. So, about a week later, I come to Leslie and I say, I've kind of done a, you know, bit of a turn on this. Please bear, because we had already invested quite a bit of thought into like how we were going to accumulate objects. So I said, well, why don't we, I told her about this idea. And she said, oh, that will be beautiful. I know, John, I know you. It will be beautiful. But, dude, where is the audience part? Where's the community participation aspect of it? Always reeling you back in. Some there, yeah, good point. Well, we could have the students do this, what Eric did, which would have been probably a fiasco. Because basically one guy did this. So I started thinking about that, now what? And it just hit me, you know, newspaper clippings. My mother has saved clippings and sent them to me throughout my life. They're all over the place, tucked in books. It's, you know, and I thought, well, that's the thing, that's the artifact aspect of it. And shit, it's going to be a lot easier to store those things than it is like somebody's, you know, Model T or something that they're going to bring in. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it was hard to convince Leslie and the crew that was a good, it would work. It would all be unified. There'd be the, you know, this collection, this huge collection, and then there'd be all these other submissions. And I think we were all convinced that was the way to go. So it's kind of interesting that it kind of, I think, and I tell this to I notice one of my students come in here, I tell them all the time, you know, be open to the possibilities of the thing changing for the better. And also, don't necessarily think that the path of least resistance is a bad thing. So it all kind of, we all agreed, and that's when the whole process started of Jason pretty much taking the helm in terms of collecting submissions. You know, what would the loan agreement look like? You know, what would the parameters be? And that's when we decided, why not a whole, you know, someone saved a newspaper from the, you know, moon landing. Why not? You know. So we started, I think, back in October, collecting. Oh, another thing is I did it just to see how it might go, because we were concerned, do students even know what a newspaper is? And I'm not saying that to be an asshole. I mean, I'm saying, you know, really, the way things are going. So I did a test with a couple of my classes just to see what might happen. I didn't say you have to do it. I said I'd like you to do it. You know, it'd be great if you did. And I did just kind of see what happened, and a lot of them are actually in the show, because there were some nice responses, and that gave me confidence, and I think by extension the museum staff confidence that we would get something of use. So that's how that all happened. And already how we decided to hang these things. I wanted to be, you know, since I've been saving these things, I wanted to be kind of careful with them so that they could be, you know, returned to their status as a collection of artifacts. I didn't want to drill holes in the newspapers or do anything to them. So I came up with this idea of there's a piece of sheet metal inside the paper that it's you know, hidden by. And then I found these magnets at Harbor Freight that were relatively inexpensive that are hooks. And so we removed the hook from the magnet and then replaced it with this L-shaped threaded rod that was cut to a certain length. And so that way we wouldn't do, you know, and I did a test in my studio to make sure it wasn't going to fall on anybody and slit their throats or heads or whatever. And it's the few that I did back in last fall are still hanging in my studio fine without any problems. So I was confident that it was working. And I asked Eric when he was kind of putting it together to vary the gesture on the birds, where, you know, sometimes the metal's more open or closed, just to create variation in the way the birds are flying. And he put some staples in to hold it together. And then I asked that they have the thickest fishing line that they could afford from their budget, so that you get this kind of light thing going on. I didn't want to, you know, try to hide the fishing line. I wanted to actually emphasize it, and I think that turned out to be a pretty good move, because a lot of this was like speculation when it was being designed. What would it look like? The other thing that we figured out pretty early on was the density of the birds in the space, and so I made a little model in my studio that where I you know, kind of replicated on a smaller scale the tiles here, and then I figured out how many could be hung from each rectangle in order to give it density, enough density but not too much, you know, based on the fact that they wouldn't all be at the same level. So I felt that it could, you know, I could get quite a few, so I came up with this, you know, 3 on each of the long lengths, and then 1 on the short sides. And, you know, I did a test and looked under it to see how it looked, and it looked good. So we had that figured out pretty early on. So then I did the math on how many tiles there were, and so how many papers you would need, and it came out to basically 4 years worth. So this is 4 years of the Jones, which is 2010, 11, 12, and 13. And he started at this end of 2010. So it should, if you can see any of the dates on these, they should be 2010. And then it moves through the space and out the door, which I love, of the museum. And it would end with 2013 out there. And I think he pretty much used the whole listening to suggestions, and you know, we went back and forth with a couple of things. And when he first started hanging it, I came down a couple times to see it, how it was progressing, and made a few suggestions about height here. But we figured we wanted it to be kind of like you're looking at it here to get the top layer, and then we wanted it, I think it's 9 feet from the ground. We wanted it to be something that people couldn't jump up and grab, but that you could actually read the lower level on it. So that was, you know, we kind of, and then everything, and multiple levels in between. So this was kind of automatic, and so I was able to, along with Jason, to really concentrate on getting the submissions, you know, kind of being pretty proactive, and, you know, like we did the Jonesboro collection event, which was a very successful one, and a lot of those ended up in the show. And Jason did a few where, you know, in couple of bookstores, and I think they did one out at Chuckalisa. So we kind of really, we did one at Rhodes. We got some great ones there. And so it all went pretty smoothly. I don't think there was ever any panic or anything, at least not on my part.
Did you jury the selections?
Yeah, so let's go down there then and talk.